Hello and welcome to Picture Me Coding. My name is Eric Aker. My co-host with me as always, Mike Mull. Hello, Mike.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing pretty well.
You prepared for the hurricane coming this weekend?
No, not at all.
All right, let's get to it then. Lay it on me. What do you got for me this week?
So I think we're doing a little bit of a San Diego theme this week, and my choice is the latest album from the charmingly named Cattle Decapitation.
Yes, hard to forget the name of that band.
The album's called Terra Sight. It's a little bit different than their last album, Death Atlas, but still pretty hard and still pretty bleak. Um, it's kind of right on the edge of there's this category of extreme metal, and this is kind of sort of at the point where beyond this, I don't really like it very much, but this I like. It's sort of a combination of hardcore and death metal, I guess, and still a little bit melodic, and it's got sort of the strange voices and stuff, but you can still understand what they're saying. Sometimes the things that they're saying are a little bit discouraging. There's a lyric in one of the songs about something like a swarm of flies. There's so many of us that we need to die.
Oh,
something along those lines. Yeah,
geez.
that's sort of a typical theme for their work, though. So,
Do you like the bleakness and the hardness in combination, or do you think you could just have bleak or just hard and still be satisfied? I mean, what maybe the bleak? What is the bleak like a little bit of salt and pepper on the metal, or is it a real key feature of the metal?
I think it's a pretty key feature of this type of metal. Um, I think if you're doing prog metal or sort of standard 1970s style metal, you could maybe get away with some cheerful themes. But to me, you know, to be fair, it's not quite as bleak as maybe a typical black metal album,
Hmm.
but I can't usually understand a typical black metal album anyway. So,
Mm-hmm. Still a little bit of San Diego optimism in Cattle Decapitate. You can't just scrub that sunshine, sand, and surf out of it.
yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a underlying theme of, you know, the world is terrible. We're destroying it. We're all going to die. But maybe if we didn't all eat meat, uh, things would get better.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of optimism there.
Okay, there's a way out. Nice, I like it.
Yeah.
I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I'll take that. Cattle Decapitation. My pick for this week too. When you said you want to talk about cattle decapitation, I thought, man, good opportunity for me to talk about this band I've been listening to called Obits. Obits is a Rick Froberg band. Rick Froberg, known for Drive Like Jehu and the Hot Snakes. And I was a huge, huge Drive Like Jehu fan. They were like this incredible eye opening experience for me. And I had this kind of goofy pride that they were from San Diego too. Like when I read Joan Didion, she's got this California voice. I have this weird little goofy pride, like, oh, she's from California too. She represents us. She's so smart. So I've been listening to this Obits album, which I hadn't heard of Obits. And actually, Rick Froberg passed away last month. And I was bummed when I heard he passed away. It's still almost even hard to think about because I was just so inspired by the work he'd done. The first song on the album I'm listening to, "I Blame You," is called "Widow of My Dreams," and it's just like a classic Rick Froberg song. It's rocking. It's like riding right up to the edge of just noise, pure noise. The thing I was liked about his music, Drive Like Jehu models this really. There's something like dangerous about music that may be noise if you're not attuned to it. Other people might hear it and they go, oh, "This is just noise," but there's something interesting and maybe melodic, but there's just really something working in there. In 2014, the Drive Like Jehu got back together and played the Oregon Pavilion in San Diego and Balboa Park for this one show. And I remember Rick Froberg was on stage, and he's like, "Wow, it's amazing! There's so many people here to listen to our noise." He's very, very dismissive about what their music was, but I loved it so much. It like expanded what felt musical for me. It's just there's this like dangerousness in music that might be noise, and there's just like a really driving quality to it. Um, there's also some bluesy singing on "I Blame You," which kind of surprised me, and then I felt kind of naive, like, why didn't I ever notice there's a bluesy tone in his voice before? There's a song on there called "Light Sweet Crude" that bluesy sound really works on. Not everything on the record works for me, but the thing I liked about it was I hadn't heard of this band. I felt remiss when I read about Rick Froberg dying. I found out about this band and I had to listen to him. And there's no loss of energy from the stuff from 20 years before. It still feels like vital and awake and noisy, just like Bullet Train to Vegas, a great Drive Like Jehu song.
Yeah, I really like this album too. The first Obits album. It's definitely a slightly different vibe than Yank Crime, but it's yeah, I mean it's pretty straightforward rock and roll, but yeah, there's something intense about it that makes you want to listen to it more closely.
Driving. You say straight ahead rock and roll. There definitely is in that there, but there's the noise quality too, which I like. I think I might have told you the story, but in Chicago, I went to the Hot Snakes play probably 2000, 2001. And after this tiny little venue is this bowling alley falling apart, ceiling tiles falling out of the ceiling. A friend of mine stole a bunch of bowling shoes from the place. So we had these random bowling shoes. I probably shouldn't admit to that. I saw a lot of great bands play there, and it's kind of like Shea Cafe in San Diego. You could fit maybe 50 people in front of the stage, just crammed into this stage that's 2 feet off the ground or something like that. And I walked up to them, and I had just been so inspired by Rick Froberg's music for so many years. And I said, wow, it's amazing to meet you finally. You are one of my musical heroes. And he said, that's pretty sad. And I was like, okay, yeah. And then I went and I talked to John Reese. I had met John Reese before. He's a guitarist from Rocket from the Crypt, and he's in Drive Like Jehu and the Hot Snakes. And the thing I want you to know is if you want to walk up to someone who plays music and say just stupid stuff to them and have them be totally nice and humble, you should go talk to John Reese, because it doesn't matter what stupid crap comes out of your mouth. He'll be totally nice to you. He was totally nice to me. But I still have a lot of respect and love for the work of Rick Froberg. Maybe that's a never meet your hero story, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I sort of wonder why none of these bands from Drive Like Jehu or Hot Snakes or Obits made it bigger. They all seem like bands that could have broken out, had some radio play, but I don't think even most people know Drive by Jehu well.
Yeah, that surprised me. I just assumed they're hugely famous still. I remember reading about them in Rolling Stone and being like, yeah, they're in Rolling Stone. There's a review in there. Although the review I remember was kind of middling. It wasn't that celebrating them. I just thought, wow, they don't get it. This is one of the most groundbreaking and amazing pieces of music that I've ever heard. Everybody has to hear it. Here's my question for you. You drive around in the car, you got REM playing, your mom says, turn off this noise. If we designed a scale, the Mike's Mom noise scale, REM is, and I don't know what's this, is it a logarithmic scale? So maybe it goes up 1 to 100 or something. Where's Cattle Decapitation? Where's Drive Like Jehu? Where's REM? I put REM, maybe Drive Like Jehu a little bit to the right, Cattle Decapitation a little bit to the right. What do you say about that?
Yeah, REM is kind of like a 2 on the Richter scale, so to speak. It's
a true noise scale is what we're calling this.
Yeah, if you're super sensitive, you might feel that. This may be a totally California thing, so most of the world may not know what a 3 on the Richter scale earthquake feels like, but yeah, so REM's maybe like a 2. Drive by Jehu would probably be like a solid 4, 4.5, and Cattle Decapitation is kind of like the coast of Alaska falling into the Pacific Ocean, sort of like a solid 10. I think my mother would have probably jumped out of the car while it was moving.
True noise scale. Yeah. I just love the danger in noise. Is it noise? Is it music? There's something right on the edge. And there's some bands that really have done that. That's good. That's a good San Diego call out, though. I still have a lot of pride for all the music that's come out of San Diego. For our software discussion this week, well, you had said something, I think, and it reminded me of this question that I have had in the past where I've been employed. My title has been software engineer in past jobs. And I wondered, is there a point at which we can start calling ourselves, quote unquote, real engineers? I'm a fake engineer, right? Am I a fake engineer? Are you a fake engineer? Are we real?
I'm still on the fence about it, partially because I don't know if our profession quite qualifies as engineering. And secondly, because I'm not entirely sure that I want to be an engineer.
There's a lot to unpack there. What does it qualify as real engineering? Do you want to be an engineer? Can you remember the second question? I want to come back to it.
I will remember it.
Okay. Qualifies. Do you want to be? So Hillel Wayne is a guy who does courses on TLA Plus and other software engineering courses. And he has like a non-software background, I believe. And he has this really analytical way of approaching these questions. What's the history of this term and how it's existed in our industry? He wrote this 3-part blog post, which I know you've read, where he interviews people who have traditional engineering backgrounds, mechanical, civil, and software engineering. He thinks, well, these are crossover people, so they'll be able to answer this question for us. Are we real engineers as software engineers? Are we like what they're doing in other fields? And he had this quote in the blog I found interesting. He says, I found in my research, people defending the title engineer rarely coherently define what an engineer is, usually boiling it down to, quote, engineers solve problems. But the most useful thing in his post, I think, is when people raise these objections, he categorizes the types of objections he's seen in the past, and he gives 6. So I want to read you his 6. One is, these are all things that software engineers do not do, which would qualify them as real engineers sometimes, or don't always do, maybe something like that. So number 1 is making something complex as part of a team. Number 2 is making something physical. So making something complex, part of a team, making something physical. Number 3 is making something according to a rigorous spec with strict principles. And number 4 is using mathematical principles in their design. So I actually would collapse, even before commenting on this, I want to collapse 3 and 4. So using math or strict logical principles. So that's 3 and 4. Number 5, working on situations with high consequences like loss of life. And number 6, doing work with certification or licensure involved. Do you agree with any of those? Do you think any of those you should throw them away, or some more important than others?
I don't disagree with them. I think he goes on to talk about these in significant detail, and some of them, for instance, the consequences item. Clearly that's true sometimes for software engineers and not true sometimes for so-called real engineers.
Yeah, totally. Can you think of examples? I would throw that one away for that reason.
Well, an example that from my own life is, I used to work on software that was used to model polymers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people who were using it were polymer scientists, but they worked adjacent to engineers, mostly mechanical, sometimes chemical engineers. But, they were looking for materials that had particular mechanical properties, but they may have been doing that so that they could make the housing for a vacuum cleaner. Mm-hmm. So if they got something wrong and built used a slightly inappropriate material for the housing of this vacuum cleaner, it probably was not going to crash and kill anyone.
Yeah, so that's not high consequences.
Yeah, and I think that's probably more common in mechanical and chemical engineering fields
Yeah.
than people in software engineering think it is.
Yeah, I bet it's, I mean, that was my example. Like someone, if I have an engineer and she's designing a new beach cooler, am I not calling that person an engineer because they're not doing something high consequences? I don't think so. I think I would still use the term engineer. I agree
Yeah.
with you. I think similarly for software, a lot of times we're working on stuff with high, financial ruin can be an effect of what we do. If we allow data to be exposed, if somebody gives us their bank account details, and we erroneously charge multiple times, I mean, that seems like high consequences to me. So it seems like the kind of fiddly thing I would throw away. One and two, something complex is part of a team, something physical. I would throw those away too. They don't seem that interesting to me. They don't seem like very specific things for us to be able to differentiate what software engineers do from engineers in other fields. I would just completely throw those away. I don't know if you're cool with that. I can't tell if you're cool with that.
Um, well, I think one of the problems with this conversation, and that this is sort of the point of why he did this research, is that I don't have a lot of firsthand experience of engineering outside of software engineering. I've kind of worked adjacent to engineers of various types, but never really on an mechanical engineering or civil engineering project. And so it's hard for me to compare those 2 points between what I have done in my career and what a mechanical engineer or civil engineer does in their career.
I think that's fair. I mean, but obviously we have worked on teams, and the physical thing, I don't think that matters really. I don't think it seems like it'd be a weird definition to say you have to build something physical to be an engineer. That seems like kind of a pointless definition to me. The two
Yeah,
objection, go ahead.
it's also kind of what you need a definition there. Like if you're writing embedded systems that go into some sort of hardware controller, are you making a physical thing?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah, it's a fuzzy. I don't think it's a very useful distinction. The two objections that are quote unquote usual objections that I find interesting, that's not to say I agree with them, are that leaves 3 and 4, which I collapse, use math or logical principles as a spec or to build and design stuff, and then a certification as a requirement. And that last one I do see when people complain about, sometimes I'll see in social media saying, well, we're not real engineers because there's no certification. So I've seen that one come up. I'm not saying I agree with it. Those are the only two I find interesting from the objections that Wayne characterizes. So I wanted to talk about the first one first. Do we or should we use math or logical principles to build and design stuff? If this were debate, I would assign you pro and I would be con, and people would probably hate me. Do we or should we? What do you think?
this debate comes up all the time about whether or not software engineers need to know math.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be pretty evenly split between people who think it's totally unnecessary and people who think it's, sort of a crucial part of the profession.
Mm-hmm.
The point that he makes in his writing about this is that we do use math all the time in software engineering. It's just we don't think about it as math because it's discrete math.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing things like, working with logic or working with computational complexity when we analyze an algorithm. And all those things are math, and we are using those in our profession. We just don't think of it as math because what people think of as math is calculus and differential equations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what about just like if somebody says, I want to build some new software feature, but I need some data to know how to build it. I mean, that's almost in line with what the objection is saying we don't do. Get the data is what I would think. Does that not fit? When you say use math, I almost give it a much broader definition of, well, am I using data to determine what I'm going to build? Maybe that's too flimsy. What do you think?
I would need some clarification on that. When you say need the data, are you talking about information from the end user, or are you talking about, I don't know, give me an example.
So yeah, that's probably too abstract. I got to say that for a long time, I had anxiety that I didn't use much data in my work, that I would get a request to build something and I would just go with my gut. Oh, okay. I think I probably need to use this data store, and I need to, maybe if I'm using a database, I need to put an index here. But I wasn't planning it out. I wasn't writing down numbers and, you know, doing arithmetic to figure it out.
Do you mean like doing experiments to figure out, is the latency going to be adequate?
Yeah, yeah, stuff like that, or even just taking measurements of existing systems and watching what they do. You know, you and I, one of the best projects I ever worked on was quite a long time ago, and it required me to run a profiler on this Python application that you and I had built together. You had said, I think there's a function in this process that's getting called millions of times. I ran the profiler. I confirmed that your intuition was right. We determined that if we used, a different way, like more numerical computation libraries in Python, that we could like vastly speed up this computation. And we did that based on this knowledge from profiling. We wrote that, and we went from 7 days for this process to 24 hours. It was a great success. And I felt like, yeah, I'm a real engineer. I profiled this and I got some data, and then I made a decision based on the data.
Yeah, I have to admit that does feel like engineering to me.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? So get the data. But there's all kinds of data, right? So, stored data, timing, network, profiling. Like I said, you might profile memory, you might profile time. There's newer kinds of data. Like a lot of times now, we're deploying stuff in these Kubernetes clusters, and we're using this stuff that I really, really like, open telemetry. So I can see service A called service B, which called service C, and I can see how long each one took. And suddenly I have access to data I never had access to before. It feels very fresh and new and exciting. Um, so it does sort of like I have this anxiety I have had in the past. I don't have it lately, that I don't use enough data. But it's also true that I don't always know like what data I might need. And some of the data I'm interested in is very new. Open telemetry is a pretty newish thing in terms of wide scale deployment.
There's an aspect of his point about math that I'm not sure I agree with. So, I think he makes the claim that software engineers do use math. It's just discrete math. And I agree with that. It's true for the most part. What I think is maybe different is that I think in a lot of engineering disciplines, they're using math before they build things to do, say, simulations.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm sort of guessing a little bit at what real engineers do, but I've seen, for instance, simulations of physical structures. So if you're building a building, you can make a mock-up of that building in a computer model, and then look at the stresses and strains and torsions on those physical members of that building, and you can simulate circuits up front before you commit them to a physical circuit.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the profiling example you gave is sort of similar there. You're applying something to an actual system and trying to gather some data on it, but
Mm-hmm.
there doesn't seem to be this same. I'm sure some people do it, but there doesn't seem to be a widespread use of simulating systems before they're built.
Yeah, maybe I'm talking more experimental. It's post hoc, like heuristics type of stuff is what I'm talking about. I kind of see how it does its job and then tune it based on that.
Yeah, maybe that's what you have to do in software, since it's difficult. It's difficult to build a model of your system that is substantially simpler than just building the system.
That's a good point, actually. That sounds like a very philosophical, like meta point. I could build a model of the system, but why don't I just build the thing? um, what you described, where we're talking about using data up front to design a system, that sounds very similar to a style of interview question that has gained currency in the last maybe 5 years, these are called system design interview questions. I'll give you some examples. I've heard of questions like design a URL shortening service. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about designing Twitter or designing Google Docs, where you have shared interaction with these things. And the trick with a lot of these examples is there's implicit scale. URL shortening service. There's potentially billions of URLs you may have to shorten. So you got this scale problem. How many requests? Where's the data go? You've got all these requirements you have to gather, and then you have to do some back of the envelope math. And if you're really satisfying one of these interview questions the way you're supposed to, you're showing your work in the kind of math test. That sounds very similar to what you're talking about with doing initial design up front, doing math up front in order to refine what you're doing. When interviewers are asking these system design questions, I do sometimes wonder, how often do people really do this? And I think that's what you're getting at. Do people really do that?
I think people do that, but I think thing that's somewhat unfair about that type of questions is they start with the premise that you already have a pretty solid idea of what you're going to build.
Mm-hmm.
And so that might be sort of cheating a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I think too, like, how often do you do it in isolation? So my question on how often do you actually do this is a bad question. I was really thinking, how often do you do this by yourself? Most of the time when I'm building stuff, it's this interplay between, product and engineers and trying to hash out what it is we think we're going to build that satisfies product. It's not I'm going to sit down and list all the requirements, and then there are pieces of systems where I think I have to do that. I don't know. Maybe I'm showing my naivety here. Let me ask you a different question. Can we build stuff just on vibes?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think vibe-driven development is probably something that we should codify. It would probably make a really good book.
But so, I'm serious. Can we just go with our gut sometimes? Is that if we admit that we're doing that, are we no longer serious? Are we no longer real engineers? People are not going to, if I take this stance right here, sometimes I build stuff on vibes. Are people going to hate? They're going to get hate mail.
I don't think so. I mean, this may not be exactly what you mean, but there are a lot of times where I have an instinct about how something should be built, but I'm not certain about it. Mm-hmm. And so I sit down and start messing with things, building bits and pieces and seeing if my initial instincts are, heading in the right direction. And I would guess, I don't know this is true either, but I would guess that engineers in other fields do that as well. I mean, it's probably trickier if you are, building, sanitation plant or something. I don't know. Mm-hmm. If you're doing a large scale civil engineering project, you probably can't just hack on stuff and get some vibes about it. But
yeah, maybe it's a scale question. If I'm going to have a 10-acre facility, it's pretty dangerous to do that on vibes. And if I'm going to have a service that scales to millions of requests every second, that's pretty dangerous to do on vibes.
Sure, but I think, even there you can probably, you instinctively know that if you're talking about millions of requests per second, you're probably not going to be running that all on one machine. Mm-hmm. But you can probably build something on one machine that you can do some testing on to see if it's going to scale the way you think it would scale.
So that's pretty interesting. You're talking about experimentation. Again, try it, get the data, see how it performs.
Yeah, I mean, I've done this in the past in situations where, I knew that the approach to scaling things was going to be just adding servers until it could handle the capacity. But the sort of starting point there is to figure out how much can one server handle. Mm-hmm. So
There's a rule for our show so far, Mike, where we cannot go an episode without a Wittgenstein reference.
is it just Wittgenstein references, or
I I
can it
I think
be Wittgenstein and or an experience you had at Cal?
I'd maybe take issue with that. But I want to say this week's Wittgenstein reference, not my fault. This is Hillel Wayne. He's talking about this the complaint that software engineers are not real engineers. And he starts talking about the language we're using here, why we call a thing an engineer. He writes something. He talks about Wittgenstein. He actually says this is like out of Wittgenstein. Something like engineering is a family of related concepts where we judge whether something belongs based on how much it resembles other things in the family. In other words, engineering is what engineers do. In other words, something becomes engineering if enough engineers say it is engineering. Sometimes people talk about this from Wittgenstein as meaning is use, or use is meaning. How a word is used is what it means. Um, so I guess that's kind of a thing that perspective does float around in my head a lot, because I was really brainwashed into it 20 years ago and I can't ever let it go. um, but it does make me wonder. So this is like a foundational point. Sure, an engineer is how we use the term engineer. And if people use the term software engineer sensibly, then we're software engineers. I don't actually care that much about that distinction. Um, why does the conversation come up then? You've heard people have this complaint before, have you, in your career?
Which complaint specifically?
Have you heard people consistently raise this objection that software engineers are not, quote, real engineers?
I've heard it, and I've heard real engineers make the claim that software engineering is not real engineering.
Hmm.
And I've also heard the claim from software people that we should not call ourselves software engineers because what we do is not engineering. And I think those are two slightly different viewpoints.
Hmm.
Because I think in the latter case, I think there is this subsection of the software, or the people who do programming, who don't want to call themselves engineers. They want to be called programmers. They want to be called software developers. And they feel like engineering is an overly restrictive term for what they see as a creative, craft-like endeavor.
So it, like, instead of a software engineers, we'd be like sandwich artists or something.
Yeah, I don't know what the software equivalent of like a mixologist would be, but something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is sometimes people raise this objection because they don't want that what they're doing they feel is more creative than engineering.
Yeah, and I don't agree with that because of the point that is made in the crossover articles about, regular engineering is very creative as well.
Oh yeah, it's got to be. It's got to be. I guess I see this question when it comes up, or the distinction when people want to assert that there's a distinction between software engineers and traditional engineering. I guess I'm not so interested in that distinction and whether or not it's accurate. It's kind of fun to entertain, but what interests me more is why do people feel the distinction? You raised something really interesting. People want to emphasize the creativity. I've actually always thought that the reason why people raise this is our field is so young, and it comes from a sort of anxiety about how what we're doing relates to quote unquote traditional engineering. I think our field is so young that we are still figuring out the words we want to use for it. But I actually think that this anxiety about whether or not we're engineers is more when you look at like that, the two objections that Hillel Wayne had that I called out specifically. One was certification, and the other one was math or logical principles in design. And we talked about that a little bit with, am I using data up front? To me, this speaks more to a worry about whether or not what we're doing is sufficiently professional. There's this like process of professionalization that we haven't gone through, where certification is a great example of this. If I had to have a certificate for the work I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, I might be seen as belonging more to like a well-defined professional class. And people who claim we're not real engineers, they're just anxious about whether or not we're sufficiently professional. What do you think? Am I going off road here with my weird theory?
I don't think so. I think there's also an aspect to it where there's not sort of a common body of knowledge that we feel people can be certified on.
Mm.
So I would assume that, if you're getting a medical license or passing the bar as a lawyer, there are core things that you need to know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Whether you're going into contract law or family law or some other specialization, there's probably some number of core principles that every lawyer should know at
Mm.
the beginning of their career. And I'm not sure that's as true for software yet. I think
Yet.
that I think
Sorry,
there's
I like the yet. Go ahead though.
I think there are some things where that is true. For instance, in the last 10 years, we've kind of encouraged people to look at and internalize things like the OWASP top 10. So whether you're a front end person or a back end engineer or a database developer or whatever, you should know some basic principles of cybersecurity as it relates to building applications.
Mm-hmm. These are
Uh,
OWASP top 10 rules that common exploits for applications. So if you're aware of those, you're more likely to not have those in your app.
yeah, um, but in general, if you took a cross section of the people on a typical team right now, I'm not sure exactly what the common body of knowledge would be.
Hmm.
Maybe some basic stuff about uh, computational complexity,
Mm-hmm.
the orders of sorting algorithms and stuff like that. I don't know.
It's hard not
It's
to wonder then to go right back to people complaining, hey, I studied this stuff in college and I didn't get prepared for a job.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And what's more important when you start out? Is it more crucial that you be able to understand is it more important to know how to code a red black tree, or is it more important to know how to fix a problem in Git? I don't know.
Or set up a database schema. Yeah, that's fair. So every time I hear this conversation come up where like people are making distinctions between software engineers and traditional engineers, I think it's about professionalization below the surface. This worry that we're not sufficiently professionalized. And then my immediate next thought is, well, isn't this about keeping people like me out of the profession? Close the doors a little bit. Right now it's a very young field. Still, anyone can join as long as you can just do the work, demonstrate you can do the work. I think this might worry some people. How can I distinguish my work from non professionals, from hacks?
There's the point that many people have made that in other professions, the certifications and licensing and so forth have come about because people got hurt. And it may be also that our profession doesn't have quite the motivation yet because most people are not working on software that matters all that much in terms of, killing people.
I like that you raise a comparison to other fields. You talk about the bar, you talk about medical certification. I think that if we have this conversation, we don't think about those other fields, certification, professionalization, and other fields, and it's a historically naive conversation. Um, I was curious, and I just did a very small amount of reading. There's a famous engineering exam in the US called the Fundamentals of Engineering. It was started in 1965. That's pretty long after the profession of engineering, electrical engineering existed, and by the end of the 19th century at least, mechanical engineering the same. So pretty long time after it emerges as a profession. It seems like after that, then you start having university coursework to support that profession. And then at some point beyond that, you may have certification that shows up. Similarly, the bar, it wasn't until, legal profession has existed for centuries. So maybe this is a really cheap example, but according to the simple thing I looked up on Wikipedia, it was 1921. American Bar Association said we prefer that you've passed a written bar examination, not just graduated with a diploma in order to practice law in this country. So this is like a long time after the profession starts does certification emerge.
Yeah, I think there's probably, you've said this as well, but it may just be that this profession hasn't existed long enough. People have been programming professionally since the 1950s. And really the idea of software engineering is something that kind of came into vogue in maybe the 70s or 80s. So we're talking about a profession that's, maybe less than 50 years old. So maybe, how long was the law around or the medical profession around before people started to worry about these things?
Oh, hundreds of years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the question I said, let's defer on. You said something I found very interesting, which is I may not want to be a real engineer. Why did you say that?
So in my career, I've kind of gone through this series of phases. Like you, I did not go through a computer science or software engineering curriculum. In my case, it's because I'm super old and there weren't such things when I was at university. um, I started out as a hacker. I bought my own computer and just wanted to figure out how things worked. And for a long time in my early career, I felt like that's what I was. That was kind of my identity as a software developer, was a little bit of a hacker. And probably 10 or 15 years into my career, I started to think, I should probably try to be more of an engineer. So started to think about things like QA and the sort of principles that you read about, cohesion and that kind of thing. And at some point, I started to feel like, this stuff is not really engineering. So maybe this is, this seems to be a profession where you have to kind of build things to understand things. So maybe it is sort of a craftsman-like profession. Maybe it isn't engineering in the traditional sense. I think I kind of gone through a later phase where I'm kind of swinging back the other way, where I'm thinking maybe it really is engineering. It's just that we have been sort of slow to pick up engineering principles. So, both you and I have had interest in recent years about things like formal methods and functional programming and stuff like that. Things like TLA. And so I think I'm still kind of on the fence about whether or not what I want to be as an engineer, but I do feel like that what I do want to understand the things that I'm building better.
Yeah,
and
me too.
Maybe that's kind of like the doorway to real engineering.
I mean, I was kind of jokingly saying before, can I just build everything on vibes? I do get this satisfaction from things I've built where I have data that helps me determine that what I'm building is the right thing. On the other hand, I see this conversation as a kind of anxiety about professionalization. And I think that like those system design interview questions, I think of those as like that to me is a way of establishing that you're a member of the professional class, good and bad. There's good and bad parts of that. My bet is that if you had some kind of software engineering certification test, sure, you'd have some algorithms on there, but I bet it wouldn't mostly be algorithms. If you had to sit for like a software bar, I bet it'd be questions like design Twitter, design a URL shortening service, and then you'd get some certificate. I think it's worth asking, if we were further professionalized, if we had certificates like this, who does this help? Well, if I'm interviewing candidates for roles, it probably helps me. If I want to like have some accreditation for my entire org and everybody's certified, maybe that helps or something. So maybe there's accountability in there. But on the other hand, the goal here, I think the underlying goal is to actually reduce the population of people who can be called software engineers. That would be the goal of like a certification thing. Yeah, maybe the goal is to improve candidates, who you're interviewing, but I don't think that's necessarily a result of this because you're reducing your candidate pool. Right now, anybody who can learn the stuff and prove that they can do it, maybe there's a very hard implication in my quote unquote prove they can do it, but anybody who can do it can join. It's extremely egalitarian. And that's something I find very interesting about our field. Somebody like me, I studied English, I studied philosophy, I have a demonstrated track record building stuff. There's a job for me. The doors are wide open. That's pretty cool. I almost think there aren't even many other fields like that. If you could demonstrate you can do the work, you're welcome.
Yeah, certainly not now. I think there was probably a time when if you could build a steam engine, you were a mechanical engineer.
Right.
Didn't really matter what you did at university. But yeah, I would personally miss it if we started gatekeeping in that way. I think it would be, I would feel like that would diminish the profession a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a hard argument because you do feel like eventually there has to be something that there has to be some things that people in this profession have to know to be qualified to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think my personal take is it's probably just a matter of still figuring out what those things are.
Oh, I think I agree with you somewhat. This stuff is coming. It's not happening right now. The field is wide open right now. And I would argue there are social pressures at work which prevent it from happening. So if we have certification, we're restricting the pool of people who are considered members. And the social pressure working against that right now, there's too many open jobs. There are too many companies that want to hire engineers. So there's no social incentive to actually make it harder to be a software engineer. Eventually, I think that'll change. You'll probably have more listings at some point in the future than you have, or sorry, probably have more candidates than jobs. And then university coursework will probably get a little more specific in teaching the work that we do. And then certification will surely follow. I think it's going to happen. I think we're just in this really cool, exciting period, where you could be like the 60s and 70s hippies who are writing code. Comes to me, I'm a Linux hobbyist, I'm writing code. Another 50 years for our grandkids. I don't think that's going to happen.
It's probably happening a little bit around the edges already. You probably can't be a network engineer without some sort of certification, or maybe like a SOC analyst type of role. You probably have to at least get some sort of training after the fact to consider yourself to be official in that role.
I mean, I think this is another thing where if we compare to other fields where certification exists, law is one. You and I have worked with people who have mechanical engineering, electrical engineering backgrounds. They went into software because there weren't enough jobs. And there are figures published every year in this country where the percentage of jobs for people graduating from law school, it fluctuates up and down. I think 10 years ago, it was 60, 70%, so not 100%. Now it's gone back up. There's a lot more jobs for graduating lawyers. So you would think, certification has a kind of role to play there. We want to make sure we're restricting to this established bar of knowledge. But the other subtle part of this is, yeah, we don't want as many people in the field. Maybe that's overly cynical.
It probably is also affected by the fact that there's such an abundance of jobs in certain fields that are unfilled. Cybersecurity stuff, certain types of software engineering, there's just way more open positions than there are people to fill them. So we're probably still in a phase where people are willing to hire people who are not technically qualified to do the job and train them up.
Interesting. What do you think you'll say when somebody says to you in the future, we're not real engineers. Software engineering is just more like a mixologist. That was your example. I really liked a software mixologist. What are you going to say if somebody says that to you?
Well, I will probably be retired, so
I don't think it's going to happen in the next year or two.
I will likely say, cool with me. Glad I managed to retire before that was codified, but it's good to know.
Yeah, I guess I'm not so worried about the distinction. I am interested in the what I see as the worry or anxiety underneath the distinction as it gets raised. That concerns me. And I look forward to the future and I think, well, it's kind of a bummer if people like you and me have a much harder time getting into the field. Well, that bums me out a little bit.
There could be some benefits to certain types of certification, though, going back to what we were talking about last week. The interviewing process in our business is weird. And I think part of the reason is because there's nothing that you can take for granted. Like I assume if you were interviewing a lawyer and they've passed the bar, you can sort of take for granted that they are at least minimally qualified to do the job. And I think in our profession, when you come across a new person, you can't really trust their resume. So, maybe there's usefulness in having some sort of baseline certification that says, I know enough of this stuff to have passed this test. It hasn't really worked that well so far because most of the certifications seem to be very specific to a technology platform. But, if somebody could come up with a test that everyone agreed was useful for the profession, I could see how it would be beneficial to, people coming into the profession who they don't need to quite prove so much about themselves anymore.
So here's my suggestion for your next career. Make that test. System design interview questions, a little bit of algorithm stuff, a little bit of general knowledge, and go into a room. I sit for the software bar. That company is out there waiting for you to start it, Mike.
Is it going to be different than these studying for the interview books?
No, you can just copy all that stuff. But you'd be like, now we're certifying you. You are right. Certified level something. I don't know. I think the bar is just pass or no pass.
Computer science aptitude test.
I don't even know if I would call that. I would call it like software engineer certification. You'd have people would be like, please take my money. Actually, I don't know. You'd have to convince people.
I suspect there's probably something out there along those lines, like from maybe the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon or something like that.
Oh, I was almost thinking professionalization. If I join ACM, is that good enough? I'm a card carrying member of ACM. I'm cool, right? I'm laughing because you just pay them.
Yeah, I wish that were true.
All right. Well, I learned a lot as always hanging out with you. I am glad we could talk about this, but once again, I'm so disappointed you didn't give me a complete answer that I could just pull out of my wallet and show people every time this comes up in the future.
Well, if you want, you can tell people that Mike said I was an engineer. So
Mike said I was an engineer, and he said he didn't want to be one. So, all right, this is Picture Me Coding. I am Eric Gaker, co-host Mike Mall. We will see you next week.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.